please feel free to come even further to the front if you would like to. We'll try and leave maximum time for discussion, because I know that many of you in the room will have a lot to say on this subject, and many online as well. Just before we start, a quick note on the evolution of this session. So when we put in our bids for sessions in HNPW, the world was a very different looking place. And we thought we could talk maybe in more detail about what communities that we at Ground Truth Solutions and others on the panel work with have to say about priorities about climate smart response. And then the world changed. So we've changed the focus of this session to look at what we can do in this moment of really brutal cuts and prioritization to keep the climate smart innovations and progress that we've seen tentatively in the last few years front and center as the system strips back to life-saving. And talking to the panelists, we actually thought many of the priorities around this that we hear from communities are a sort of double win. They help to keep humanitarian assistance more climate smart and help the humanitarian system to adapt to the climate crisis. And they also help us make the best use of scarce resources. So we're now looking at what those win-win situations are, which can help to move humanitarian assistance into a more climate smart space, and at the same time help to make humanitarian response more efficient and make the best use of scarce resources. Let me just have a quick check to see how we're doing online. Great. People are filing in online and in real life. So we will get started. Thank you so much for coming today, and a very warm welcome to all of you in the room and online. We're talking about climate smart response in a funding crisis, and we're taking the community view. So what do the communities that we at Ground Truth Solutions and my esteemed fellow panelists, who I'll introduce in a second, what do the people we work with every day tell us that they need to see and want to see from the future of humanitarian assistance to make humanitarian assistance more climate smart, and also to make more effective use of scarce resources in this extraordinary moment in humanitarian action. So looking around the room, I know I don't need to tell any of you this, but it is very, very obvious that the climate crisis is hitting vulnerable communities extremely hard. We've now tipped over from a period where the climate crisis felt like something slightly theoretical, slightly future, to something that all of us in every country that we've come from around the room are living from day to day. Last year was the hottest year on record again. We saw record-breaking storms in the Atlantic, record-breaking heat waves. We saw drought in Southern Africa. We saw floods in East Africa, and we saw climate-driven weather events affect up to 93 million people around the world. It's very obvious to all of us in the room, but those of us who have done the least to cause this crisis are the ones suffering its worst impacts. Ground Truth Solutions have just released a report looking at 2 years of data across 12 countries, interviews with 34,000 people experiencing humanitarian crisis around the world. And this feeling that things are changing, this feeling that the people are really living the impacts of the climate crisis, comes out loud and clear in every single interview that we've done. We see people extremely concerned about their future, and we hear from people that they feel their baseline situation is getting worse day by day. People no longer feel that a crisis is just a little blip after which they will return to a stable baseline. People really feel that their day-to-day is getting worse. People tell us that they're more affected by so-called natural disasters, and that those natural disasters come more frequently, are more unusual for the place that they live, and have more devastating impacts. And they also feel the chronic impacts of climate change. They feel the squeeze on their livelihoods, on agriculture, on traditional ways of making a living. And people are extremely concerned about the future of those livelihoods and the future, in some cases, of the places that they live. One thing we hear loud and clear from everyone is that short-term humanitarian aid isn't cutting it. It's not what people need at this moment. Even in the midst of acute crisis, people are thinking about recovery, people are thinking about investing in the future, and people are thinking about the investments that would stop these crises from happening in the first place. I'm just going to read one quote from Chad. Damien, I see you in the back. One quote from our work in Chad, which really jumped out to me, but there are many, many, many stories like this. So this report came to us from a man called Suleiman in Chad, who shared the following with us. He said, "There have been so many changes to the environment. Before, this area was completely covered by bushes and leafy trees, and nowadays it doesn't rain like it used to, and because of all the charcoal production, so many trees and animals have disappeared. Before, the rain was good and the land was fertile, and we had enough grain to last an entire year for each household. This is impossible now. It doesn't rain enough, and the soil is increasingly weak. The surface of Lake Chad is considerably smaller than before. The environment is destroyed. The Sahara is encroaching on us, and it is very worrying. And this is a story that we hear from people across the world. People are really, really feeling this. The climate crisis changes who needs assistance, where they need it, and the type of assistance that's needed. And as I say this, I'm looking at Paul, who has taught me that everything I need to know about this, so I won't go into too much detail. But I think we can agree that not brilliant, but tentative progress has been made in making humanitarian assistance more climate smart, anticipating disasters more, acting earlier, and supporting people's long-term resilience. Whether or not that's the job of humanitarian actors is a different discussion, but we've been moving in this direction. But at this moment, we find ourselves in a moment of massive aid cuts and a focus on prioritizing back to life-saving, whatever an individual's definition of life-saving may be, puts this in jeopardy. And we're really seeing early indications that humanitarian leaders are swinging away from that progress towards more resilient, more long-term, earlier response, back to a much earlier version of the basics, where we're just giving people enough to get them through the week. So this progress has been put in jeopardy. Climate vulnerable communities that we speak to are very, very clear that investment in climate resilience is life-saving. They're very clear that those upstream investments that prevent crises from happening are what's needed to prevent getting trapped in a cycle of crisis. And they're very clear that what they want is not just enough to get them through the week, but enough to plan, enough to come up with strategies to help them adapt to a changing climate. We're going to argue today that not only should climate smart approaches stay central to humanitarian programming through this humanitarian reset, but that actually by focusing on climate smart response is the only way that we can make more effective and efficient use of very scarce resources. So speaking for ground truth solutions, we're pulling out 4 headline bits of feedback that we've heard from communities, in particular in Chad, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, which suggest 4 changes we need to make, which would make humanitarian assistance more fit for the climate crisis and would also help us make more efficient use of scarce humanitarian resources. The people tell us 4 things. Firstly, people want to see investments in the things that prevent crisis from happening in the first place. Engage before crisis happens and stop crisis hitting my community. Second, people want us to deliver aid that transforms, doesn't just tide people over, but helps them to recover and change their lives. Third, communities express severe frustration with the fact that often external actors will come in to a community that's been struggling, adapting, innovating to deal with the impacts of climate and act as if they were walking into a blank slate. So build with communities, not for them. And fourth, we need to anticipate and respond to the right things. And the feedback we have right now says we're not getting that right. I'm really delighted to be joined by a stellar panel who are going to address each of these issues in turn. So first of all, online joining us, we have Adesso Kasivi, who is the Africa Regional Lead for GNDR, the global network of CSOs for disaster reduction. And Kasivi is going to be talking to us about why acting to prevent and not just respond to disasters is absolutely critical. Secondly, here with me in the room, we have Michael Lillis, who's a humanitarian manager at Give Directly. And he's going to make a strong case for the fact that aid that transforms people's lives, aid that helps people recover from crisis, not just survive, makes not just moral, but also economic sense. And I think at this moment, we have to make both those arguments. Then we're delighted to be joined online by Ahmed Sharbin, who is the Vice President of the Maldivian Red Crescent, and he's also a meteorologist. He's going to make the case for why it's absolutely critical that we build with, rather than for, communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. And then last but by no means least, also joining us online, we have Sunaina Sen, who is the Director of Programs and Operations at Resurgence, who provide inclusive early warning services. She's going to explain the importance of anticipating and responding to the right things and how communities have a key role to play in that. So I'm going to hand over to our panelists. That's quite enough from me. Pam, I don't know if from your end you're able to make sure that whoever is speaking is spotlighted, or whether that's our colleague upstairs who's able to do that. But that would be great. Brilliant. Thanks, Mary. So Kosivi, we're going to turn to you first. We hear loud and clear from the communities we work with that investing to prevent crises before they happen is a much better approach than getting stuck in a repetitive cycle of crisis response. This is obviously central to the work that you and your network do. How do you see this playing out in your work, and what should we do about it? So over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Apologies, my camera is not functioning. But before I start my intervention, I would like to say that I want this to be very interactive. Therefore, I've put two questions on the screen that you will see. And I think I have 10 minutes. I will stop to some points and I will invite the room to share with me their reflection on these very simple questions I put on the screen, and thanks to the technical expert who has already displayed the question. Thank you so much. So it's important to remind that 10 years back, the entire planet welcomed the Sendai framework for disaster reduction, then the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreements later. But all this happened the same year. And a year after, the Global Humanitarian Summit adopted the Grand Bargain, and the resolution was to enhance the humanitarian actors' timely intervention when they are needed. The first question I asked myself is why humanitarian summits was scheduled after the three key agreements I mentioned earlier. That's my first question. The global reports show that despite the remarkable efforts, disasters are increasing in frequency and in intensity. The request for humanitarian then for their support is increasing, while unfortunately resources are aggressively cut off. We can say, or we are tempted to say, that our leaders are sailing against the tide. A year back, the northern part of Chad, as Sophie said, was literally washed by a severe and unprecedented rain because of lack of preparedness measures. A year back, or 3 years back, the northern parts of Niger faced similar situation, enhancing the poverty of communities who have lost goods, livelihood, hospitals, and many other things. These situations are making favorable, unfortunately, bed to terrorism, criminalities, and number of displaced people are increasing years after years. Now, I have another question. Is it really time for the humanitarian sector to be revamped? Indeed, in a situation of climate crisis and funding restriction, humanitarians should shift from its traditional role to invest in disaster prevention. In doing so, we can all anticipate the occurrence of disaster, and we can better understand the sustainable humanitarian solutions that not only are provided immediately, that do not provide immediate solutions, but essentially enable the capacity of the victims of situations that require humanitarian intervention to build back better. Climate change remains the key risk driver, as it is challenging every sector despite the skepticism shown by some people till now. Failing to plan humanitarian action in a way that it includes climate change impact should surely make the humanitarian intervention less efficient and maybe ineffective on the ground. Now, colleagues in the room, I would like to come back to my questions. I don't know if any of you has reflected and would like to share its reflection. Sophie, if you can help me, if anyone wants to share its reflection about the questions.
I can indeed. I'm happy to see if there's any hands in the room. So any reflections from any of you in the room on the questions that Kosivi has posed to us? Oh, yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. This is such an important topic. My name's Alison Hall. I'm the founder of Seeds for Development, and we're a small community. We're not a community-based organisation because I'm British, but we work with communities in northern Uganda. But for me, as a British person, what is security and how I feel secure, I think, is going to bed at night and not worrying if I wake up in the morning.
I think that's a great answer. Any other reflections in the room? Yes, Mark, go ahead.
I'm good. Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Harvey from Resurgence, also from London. My colleague Sunena will be speaking later on the panel. Yes, I completely agree with the proposal that the humanitarian sector focuses on risk reduction. And I think that there's been a period of about 10 years where the humanitarian sector has been engaged in anticipatory action, but hasn't really looked at how do we help local communities, local systems manage risk and own community-led early warning systems. I think it's forecast-based financing, which is what it was originally called, was an honest term for a form of humanitarian financing rather than community enablement and resilience building. So I think this discussion is really timely because I think it was a missed pillar to begin with, and it becomes an even more important pillar as financing in the system reduces. So there's less money going into the system. Cash remains really critical, but I think actually building resilience in cities to complement the cash and actually to enable communities to prepare, to respond, to endure without cash as well is key too. So the two should be working together more effectively, I think, within this context of disaster risk reduction, building local resilience.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Cassiva, do we have a time for one more reflection from the room?
Okay, yeah, happy to hear.
I actually don't know if there is one. Just checking. Yes, please, over to you.
Hi, Joanne Philpott, humanitarian action. Oh, security. Sorry, I've jumped ahead.
I think that's fine. Cassiva, are you happy to receive?
I'm happy to continue. Yeah, and I'll conclude thank you so much for sharing your ideas. The takeaway I'm getting from the second intervenant is the humanitarian should go beyond the finance and really integrate the well-being of communities, the sustainable well-being of communities. While security is not about buying the biggest weapon of the world, but it's about ensuring that everyone wakes up every morning feeling safe, feeling secure, and being sure that he's going to feed his family, he's going to be able to have access to hospital on time, and he's capable to express himself and share his reflection. That's how our basic security, that's where our basic security is. And thank you so much for sharing these ideas. And I agree with them, but the reality is climate change is really increasing our insecurity. And the question is, how can the humanitarian sector invest in prevention and preparedness to ensure high level of resilience of communities? So probably the response is not about buying, as we said earlier, the biggest weapon by investing in the so-called corridors of security, but it's about ensuring, making human the development process, the development initiative that we are promoting. In Africa, it's always important to remind you, colleagues, that between 2 and 5% of our gross domestic products per year is invested in adaptation. In Togo, my country, I've questioned a chief of a small village called Bagida at the Kosab area 4 years back. He told me that when he was a child, the sea was far, at least 4 kilometers far from his house. Today, he has moved 3 times. And these are the concrete way we express the impact of climate change. And this is probably linked to, to the sea level rise. So we are seeing the concrete impact of climate change on the ground. And I would like to invite, that's my conclusion, the humanitarian sector to not only wait for events to happen before they intervene, but to contribute in avoiding, averting, or minimizing the impact of every hazard that can hit and that can really challenge the security and the well-being of communities. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasivi, and what a clear call to action to leave us with. I'm going to turn now to Michael Lillis from Give Directly. So at this time of cuts and prioritization, all of the chat that we've heard in this building and the building across the road over the last week has been about how to do the same with less, or how to do less with less. And we've been thinking about shrinking budgets, programs, who will no longer get assistance. I've thrown you the maybe quite difficult challenge of making the case for why at this time, if we're thinking of doing the same or less with less, actually increasing the amount of aid that we're delivering to individuals. So delivering aid that transforms people's lives rather than just tiding over makes both moral and economic sense. Over to you.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, a very easy question. Thank you. So just in case you don't know who Give Directly are, we're an NGO who provide unconditional cash transfers to people living in extreme poverty and experiencing crisis. So if you've asked for some provocative thoughts, I'll sort of do my best. I mean, I think we've heard from the work from Ground Truth and the previous speaker some really clear challenges. Current assistance doesn't build resilience. People are getting stuck deeper into crises. It's too small to make a meaningful difference. Our sort of humanitarian system and triggers can sort of over-focus on the wrong things, not what communities actually care about. And then, of course, the resources we have available to respond to all this have just been decimated. So, what is the default solution? I mean, I think, as Sophie's outlined, the concern is that it's going to be sort of a back to basics, cutting aid to the bone, short term over long term. And so I'm here to sort of explore a little bit about what alternative options do we have. And just reflecting on the past few days, sitting in lots of panels, speaking to lots of people, hearing to lots of speakers. Everyone's calling, this is the moment for radical reform of the humanitarian system. I don't have the answer for that, but hopefully if you've got a simple, practical, and hopefully pragmatic idea that I think gets treated like an extremely radical one, but shouldn't be. And it's around this idea of lump sum cash transfers. It's a simple concept. Give people one larger payment instead of it spread out over multiple months. Allow them to decide how to use it. We think it's an incredibly underutilized tool, particularly in the humanitarian sector. From our own extensive experience, we've got lots of great evidence that shows how it can work. And there's a lot of great evidence out there from really challenging humanitarian settings that shows it can work, but it's not being utilized. And we've seen some really powerful results from that. And Give Directly is a very evidence-focused organization. We put a big emphasis on running randomized control trials and high quality to really demonstrate causal impact. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of what exists out there about this. To sort of frame it in what we know. This isn't a hypothetical situation. So I'm just going to give 3 examples that aren't Give Directly studies. So, we're not marking our own homework. And these are all RCTs that have been run in the last 10 years in some really challenging humanitarian settings that have looked at this exact question, this sort of comparing a monthly payment against a lump sum. So in Iraq, the Cash Consortium of Iraq ran a really interesting study that looked at what happens when you take 3 MEB style payments and you lump it together into one and have a look at the outcomes that you might see different and compare to cohorts. And this was working with IDPs, returnees, host communities in a really fragile setting. And the results were really clear that you saw lots of investments in things like productive assets and like the things you need to see like demonstrable economic recovery. And this is not calling for more resources. This is the same amount of resource being used in a different way. In emergency settings after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, another program did exactly the same and saw exactly the same results. And so like really paving the way for economic recovery. And that was a really small amount of money. It was $89 split over 3 months. So the opportunity to do it's really something quite different with same resources is there. And then again in Eastern DRC, I think this was a Mercy Corps program, and what came out there was a really clear preference that communities wanted the lump sum, allowed them to plan, allowed them to think ahead about how to manage their own situation. And importantly, the NGO found it was cheaper to run. And I'll come back with a bit of thinking that we're doing on that ourselves. And then I wanted to speak about a study that's still ongoing that Give Directly are running, which is not a humanitarian one, but I think that the logic certainly holds. And we're running a 12-year universal basic income study in Western Kenya. And we've had the results from the first 2 years. And it's looked at 3 cohorts all received $500 within that 2-year period. One got a lump sum, one got that amount spread out in monthly payments over the 2 years, and another got the same monthly payments, but they know they're guaranteed to receive that for the next 10 years. And the results were super clear. The lump sum led to bigger impacts on all economic measures. And the 2-year monthly payments was effective in consumption smoothing, and it saw some positive results. Giving cash to people is a good thing to do, but how we deliver it matters just as much as how much. So yes, at Give Directly, we believe in large unconditional cash transfers, and we think this is a really important tool for the climate crisis. The evidence shows this helps people cope with shocks, avoid negative coping strategies, invest productively, and importantly, adapt to their own individual circumstances. And just to give a quick example from a project we ran in Malawi, which was a pioneering loss and damage project. We partnered with the government of Malawi. It was funded by the Scottish government, and we're supporting households displaced by Cyclone Freddy. This was a sort of more traditional Give Directly program, a $750 transfer that would allow them to meet their basic needs, rebuild homes, rebuild livelihoods. And the results were really strong. We saw things that pointed to real recovery and resilience, new homes, investments, moving beyond survival. And this learning has informed a set of loss and damage principles that we launched at COP, which are guiding how direct cash transfers should be a key tool for responding to loss and damage around the globe. And hopefully you can find those on our website, and I think they'll be shared in the chat online. And right now we're working with CALP to convene a submission to the Loss and Damage Board, who are just about to meet to take some real key decisions about the first stages of that fund. And we think that cash could be a key modality. You can do it through governments, through civil society. It's flexible, and it's really well evidenced. And then just linking back to what we're really talking about here is the community element. We've got some research emerging from a program we're running in Malawi, where we asked recipients how they wanted to receive their cash. So moving beyond what they want, but how they want to receive it. And the results were really clear. 93% chose they wanted the full amount upfront rather than split into monthly payments, and for all the reasons that Sophie outlined before. So that's a sort of the logic and the evidence. But yes, like a quick reality check, I understand that arguing for increasing transfer sizes is going to sound a little strange given the circumstances that we face now, but hopefully there's an argument around efficiency and cost effectiveness, whatever we want to call it, that is really strong for this form of assistance. We believe that lump sums are both more effective and more efficient. We know cash is more efficient than in kind. I'm not going to reopen that debate. I think there's plenty of information out there to see, but we've been looking at sort of some of the costs from our own programming in Kenya and applying this to other cash programs that we know about. And I'm just going to give a little hypothetical about what savings can make when you move from the switch from monthly to lump sum. So this is just looking at mobile money transactions. If you were to, there's a large scale cash program, I think it's 6 months, $86 a month going to drought affected households in Kenya. If you shifted to a lump sum model, you'd save nearly $3 per household over that. That's about 1,000 households, it's $3,000. If you scale that to WFP's 2023 cash caseload in Kenya, that's over $500,000. And then you think about the savings for recipients. Really, that's what we're here about. The withdrawal fees alone, that's another over $300,000 across that caseload. So that, and just switching that modality, that's over $850,000 saved in a program. That's a 1% margin, which the private sector, you go crazy for a 1% margin because you know that those small margins turn into scale and real impact. And when you scale in the humanitarian sector, that is more people reached. That's an extra 1,000 households across that particular program. And I think, to be honest, that's a cautious estimate. That's just looking at transaction fees. You think of staff time, post-distribution monitoring, all the elements that come with running a 6-month program, savings could really increase. And then there's the harder, but probably more important benefits to quantify for recipients: less travel, less lost working time, potentially protection benefits of not having to make 6 dangerous journeys instead of 1. So I guess the bottom line is that we think that lump sums have the potential to reduce cost in cash transfer programming, as well as being an argument for being more effective. So I'll wrap up what I'm saying now. It's like, what's the sort of takeaway? I think the evidence is here. Lump sums can work across emergencies, protracted crisis, recovery, anticipatory action. They can be cheaper to deliver, they're preferred by recipients, and they're more impactful. And they put people in control, shaping responses around their priorities. Yeah, like there are risks, like there are with any program. It's not fit for every setting, like it's true for every program. But the ERC called on us to innovate or become obsolete. This feels like a potential good place to start. And as I heard on a panel yesterday, maybe from someone in this room, giving people cash has few downsides. So if we want better outcomes, we need to use better tools. So the climate challenge is already outpacing our response. Maybe this is a way that we can catch it up. Thanks, Sophie.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michael. I couldn't agree more. And one of the clearest bits of data that jumps out of this piece of analysis we've done of our last 2 years of data is people saying exactly this. One woman in particular at the end of 5 failed rainy seasons and a significant drought in Somalia said, we're receiving $30, a $30 transfer, which, you know, is better than nothing, but is really, given the scale of what we've lost and the scale of what we're facing, it's barely getting us through the week. And as you say, all of the administrative costs and thinking and machinery involved in getting that $30 transfer, couldn't we do something more efficient and effective, which transforms people's lives and doesn't just tide them over a few days? Thank you so much, and apologies for whispering in the background. We just wanted to check that we have the right box projected on the screen. So next we're going to turn to Ahmed Shabin, who is the Vice President of the Maldivian Red Crescent. Again, one thing we hear again and again from the communities we work with is that communities on the front line of the climate crisis are, of course, not sitting there just waiting for some external support to come. People have their own strategies, their own programs, their own ways of working together. Mutual aid is happening, and often external assistance completely ignores that and undermines community-led efforts. So how do you see that situation from your own perspective, and what words of wisdom do you have for humanitarian actors for how to change that? Over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. And just for to begin with, thank you for the opportunity. And I'm here representing the Maldivian Red Crescent as well as the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent National Societies. So I hope I'm representing 191 national societies that make up the whole federation as well. In addition, Maldives being a small island developing states, I also hope to reflect on the peril that's faced by the SIDS countries at the brink of climate change right now. I'm sure everyone's heard about the Maldives as a tourist destination, but if we sidestep that postcard image, we are an archipelago, a small island state with over 1,000 islands in the middle of Indian Ocean, with just 200 of them with people inhabited. The maximum elevation is 2.4 meters above sea level. So that's the maximum elevation. Just to think about, if I may change my hat to my meteorologist, climate science background, with the IPCC reports, the Maldives is very much diluted in all the maps, but looking at the ground level data, the temperature rise is very, very evident. The sea level rise is very evident. With every monsoon, the swell surges are going much inland and much further as well, and more frequently, and the rainfall patterns are changing as well. Now, coming to the question of community-based action or community action when it comes to climate change and the challenges around it, one key aspect I would like to highlight at the beginning is the importance of community-based organizations, so CBOs and NGOs and INGOs, is that we have a presence before the disaster. So we are present before, during, and after the disaster as well. We often see aid agencies channeling in, rushing in after a disaster has struck, and are usually in a race against time to pull out as well, to phase out as well. So the recovery efforts are not really prioritized. And we did see this in country, if we step back to 2 decades back to 2004 during the Indian Ocean tsunami that swept across Maldives as well. At the time, we saw multiple international agencies that flew into the country with several pots of funding. The country had gone through an unprecedented, never seen before disaster. The government was stretched thin. There was no humanitarian national organization, so the Maldivian Red Crescent did not exist at the time. We saw all the aid agencies set up camp and deliver their individual programs, which I'm sure assisted a lot of individuals. But when we reflect back, could have we done better is always at the back of our minds when we read the reports. So this experience was actually what drove the formation of the National Society. So we came into existence in 2009 after the lesson learned from the tsunami recovery program. And during the past 15 years of operations, one thing I would like to reflect is we work very closely with the National Disaster Management Authority. And in our efforts, what we see is each of us tend to come with our back donors with a little bit of pot of funding. And during the past decade or so, we've seen a lot of replication of efforts. So one example I want to throw is the effort of, because we are a spread of islands, it's difficult to centralize emergency response. Therefore, we need to build the community emergency response capacity within the communities, within the islands. So community emergency response team trainings are something that we do. And during the past decade or so, what we witnessed is the Disaster Management Authority was doing their share of trainings. The Maldivian Red Crescent was doing our share of trainings. Even the Defense Force was doing some part of their trainings as well, all backed by different donors. And we had a moment to reflect on what was going on, given a lot of replication was happening on the ground, and the community was fatigued. Like there was a fatigue of trainings, there was a fatigue of surveys and assessments and reports coming in. So it was a lead actors within the humanitarian sphere in the country to sit down and actually reflect on this and actually say no to many of the funding approaches that was coming in. And we had to standardize the training program among ourselves that if anyone is doing emergency response trainings in the Maldives, this is the policy, this is the training syllabus that we are going to deliver. Any actor can channel in the funding from wherever that's possible, but this is the training that we will deliver to the community so that there's a streamlined, orchestrated, concentrated effort to the community. And at the time of crisis, everyone's talking on the same page. So that was a pretty good lesson learned, and it didn't happen organically. It was a conscious effort on reflecting and actually trial and error and failing that we achieved this standardized delivery of trainings. Usually dealing with donor agencies, something and I'm sure many of the ground level actors would agree, is we always see a rush of activities at the end of the year in Q4 when it comes to the fiscal year of all the donors coming to an end, and there's a rush to increase the implementation percentage. This puts a huge strain on the ground level actors because we have our own annual plannings, and it's a bit of a fatigue and overwork when it comes to implementing programmatic activities. What we see, myself sitting in the governing board as well, what we hear is there's never a shortage of programmatic funds, but one of the biggest shortage is when it comes to our ask of covering overheads. something that donor agencies always shy away from is accepting that programmatic activities on the ground has administrative costs as well. You can give as much ingredients to a cook, but if you don't give them the gas or the power to actually cook with it, the ingredients would fail and spoil as well. And this is the ground reality. And so the earmarked fundings that come in, little pots of funding that comes in trying to implement somebody else's plan puts a lot of strain on the ground actors as well. Looking at the sustainability, we are at a point where we're actually competing for funds, and this puts on a moral stand as well. And when you actually get the funds, you kind of feel guilty as well to a point because of the scarcity of funds as well. So we are actually moving towards self-sustainability, towards programmatic activities rather than trying to support our programmatic program plan on aid as well. So that's the mindset that we follow. It's not an easy one. One of the other challenges when it comes to donors is the proposals and the paperwork, the reporting, and all the policies and the loopholes we need to jump through. So we are one of the national societies within the federation that was approved by one of the biggest donors to be a direct beneficiary. And then we encountered a stop order that we are all very familiar with. So we went through the whole process, and then now there's a stop order, and we don't really know how that's going to shape out. Anyway, so when it comes to proposals and reporting and on these measures, I think they need to be more community conscious, in the sense that donor agencies needs to be a bit more flexible. Just as the previous speaker mentioned, there would be risks around any programmatic activities, but they need to be more flexible and accessible to the communities as well. Just to finish up, to wrap up, I would like to finish off with the key message at the COP summit as well by the Red Cross Federation was the climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. It is a health crisis with over 500,000 people dying of just heat-related instances per year. Invest in the communities. We have the tools. It's just a matter of scaling up and building up. So we have the tools, we have the assessments, we have the training packages. It's just a matter of delivering it out and in a timely manner, early warning and early action. So we need to act ahead of the disasters. I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions further down the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Really, really appreciated, and some very clear messages to end your intervention on. We're going to turn to our fourth and final speaker, to Sunaina Sen, who works with Mark at Resurgence. She's the Director of Programs and Operations, and Resurgence, as I'm sure you'll hear more about, are providing inclusive early warning information, which is actionable by communities. We hear, Sunaina, from work in particular in Chad and Nigeria, that one of the areas that humanitarian actors have been going wrong is that we've been anticipating and responding to the wrong things by just looking at the scale of the hazard and not understanding the vulnerability and the challenges that communities who stand in harm's way are facing. We're sometimes missing where the real problems are. So I wondered, in your work, is this a problem that you encounter, and how are you working to counter it? And what are your messages for humanitarian actors on how to do better? Over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. I'm Sunaina Sen. I lead the design, development, and implementation of programs at Resurgence. Once again, thank you, Sophie and Ground Truth Solutions, for inviting me to join today's discussion and share some of our learnings from our work in the Global South, particularly from East Africa. And it's been really great to hear about my fellow panelists' experiences and learnings from across the Global South. So just to contextualize things first, Resurgence specializes in climate risk communication, which takes many forms. Our flagship program, Daraja, which means bridge in Swahili, focuses on creating a bridge between weather and climate information and vulnerable communities that require this information to take anticipatory action in the short term and resilience building actions in the medium to long term. To do this, we work with National Meteorological Services, civil society organizations, and communities as primary partners. We also work with government agencies at various levels, media, INGOs, and other relevant stakeholders as key partners. So far, we have implemented or are currently implementing the Raja in Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Kampala, and Addis Ababa, and soon Mombasa as well. We are also doing a version of the Raja in Sudan at a national scale, and you can imagine these are very different contexts. Now, my contribution to this panel session today draws from our experience working on community-based early warning systems in these geographies. We have several reports and case studies from our first phase available through our website, which gives more detailed information, and I think that should be in the chat box soon. Now, so the Raja's key approach to building resilience using forecasts and early warnings has been co-production. In simple terms, this means that everything we do as a part of the project is done along with stakeholders, particularly vulnerable groups who are key users of forecasts and early warnings. In even simpler terms, that means putting the community at the center of our work. So what does this look like in practice? So here are 4 key points from the Raja's experience. First key point, start by understanding the existing situation. This includes understanding risks, vulnerabilities, barriers, opportunities, and preferences. We also map out other related programs and structures so that we can leverage what already exists and avoid duplication and wasting money. We do this using a mix of primary and secondary research and qualitative and quantitative data, which is a pretty standard approach. Second key point, ask communities what their needs are, what they want to prioritize. Listen to them. We respect the fact that they understand their day-to-day lives a lot better than we do. They also have a good understanding of the interconnectedness of different aspects of their life, which could influence their view of anticipatory or resilience-building actions. Now, these 2 points are about anticipating the key issues and not just through expert understanding of the context, but rather by engaging with the communities who face the impacts of extreme weather. So the third key point is, as Sophie said earlier, build with communities and not for them. We co-design all the interventions with the community. We are here to facilitate the process of co-design and stakeholder engagement rather than drive it. We found that this approach creates a sense of ownership and community among the stakeholders, which has an implication on the sustainability of the interventions beyond the project as well. Fourth key point, while communities know their needs and priorities and feel ownership of their resilience, they need support to develop the necessary capacity and access the critical resources. These could involve the kind of trainings Emma Tribune mentioned, or what Michael is advocating for. As facilitators of the resilience building process, we provide capacity building support where we can. So during the active project, we are able to support the interventions with financial and technical resources. Where we can't provide direct capacity building and resource support, we try to connect the communities to other programs and organizations that may be able to support them. And these last 2 points speak to responding to the key needs of the community. So to summarize these 4 key points from the Raja's experience that I think are relevant for today's discussion, understand the existing situation, ask communities what their needs are, co-design interventions with the communities, and help develop the community's capacity and access to resources. So this was about the benefit of the co-production approach to anticipatory action and resilience building. Now, I want to make a case for the model we use in the context of the distribution of funding. A lot of times we have seen that much of the funding goes to multilaterals and big and established INGOs. We think that this model of funding distribution is going to become the go-to model even more due to the shrinking aid budgets. However, in our experience, we have found that working with local NGOs and CSOs has been immensely beneficial. These organizations are often physically based in or near the communities they serve, and even often employ community members. They have a deep understanding of the community and its dynamics, which helps us make sense of the data, community motivations, barriers, etc. They have established relationships with the community and enjoy their trust. And trust is a key ingredient for success in the kind of work we do. They understand the local networks and how and when these can be beneficial or detrimental to the process. These organizations are usually small and aren't weighed down by bureaucracy, which means they are agile and can pivot quickly in time-sensitive situations. For instance, in Sudan, where we have an ongoing project, local networks and organizations, alongside large humanitarian organizations, have been a critical factor in our ability to implement our project in a war context. It is through this approach that we were able to conduct over 3,000 household surveys across 9 states in the country within 2 weeks. Now, I can wax lyrical about the benefits of funding and partnering with local NGOs and CSOs. However, these organizations may have underdeveloped administrative capacities that are usually required by international donors, which can preclude them from receiving funding. So we believe that supporting these organizations to develop that capacity and then funding them to deliver these programs will benefit the overall ecosystem, which is a way to view the optimization of aid funding. Obviously, everything comes with a caveat. Everything I have just shared may not be relevant to every context. We have to assess the context before making decisions about the best approach because one size does not fit all. So to wrap up, vulnerable communities should be at the center of resilience building. There are different approaches to doing that, and the choice of approach depends on the context in which we operate. So if there's only one thing you should remember from the last 10 minutes or so, it is listen to communities. And with that, I will pass it back to Sophie.
Thank you so much, Sunena, and what a great note to end on. We agree as Ground Truth Solutions, we agree, that's absolutely central. So looking around the room, we have climate experts, we have people who've been working on how humanitarian action needs to adapt to the climate crisis. We have representatives of networks of civil society organizations, we have meteorologists, we have experts in early warning. So there's a lot of knowledge in this room. And as you've heard, there's a lot of knowledge on the panel. And I'm sure you all have questions for all of the speakers and want them to dive a little bit deeper. But as we turn to you, my message is feel free to ask a question to our speakers. Feel free also to add to what you've heard. Tell us what you've missed. Give us your tips for how to keep climate smart humanitarian action front and center at this moment of cuts. So comments, questions, very welcome. I'm going to open to the room here first, and then Pam is keeping an eagle eye on questions online. So Pam, I'll turn over to you in a minute to hear what questions we have online. First of all, here in the room, any questions for our panelists or anything you would like to add that we've missed? Yes, over to you.
Hi, it's Alison again from Seeds for Development. It's a question for Give Directly, I think, but for everyone. We do cash transfers directly to villages in northern Uganda. And on a really positive note is we sponsor children who've been kicked out of school because the parents can't pay their fees. And by doing these payments and bulk payments for 10 children or 16 children, the schools are able to feed all the other children, or in one case, they've actually built a classroom block. So it's really, really good. However, when we've worked with villages and communities, there's always one person who sort of holds it all together. They might have a committee, or they might have this or this and this, and they'll have they'll have their treasurer, they'll have their secretary, but there's always one key person. And the problem that we face over and over again is community jealousy. And so to the point that that one person, our trusted friend in that village, they've had their houses burnt down, they've been threatened, they've had to move. How have you come across this, and how do we address it? Anybody, please, anyone online here, so we can build on it, because it's brilliant and it really does work, I agree, but not when it puts people's lives at risk.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I'm going to take a couple more and then we'll do a round of answers if that's okay. Any other questions or comments in the room, Mark?
Yes, as I have to depart in a moment, just to come back to your question, are we measuring the wrong things? I think there's a case to be made that sometimes we're measuring the wrong we're measuring potentially the right things, but within a closed box system. So a lot of the work that's done on parametric insurance products and release early action protocols can take place, and a threshold is not met and yet there was a pretty, severe, high on the scale, high impact weather event, and communities were not alerted. So there's a closed system at play where communities get nothing. They could have been protected from a storm, a heat wave, flooding that didn't quite meet the mark because the system was closed in itself. And then within that question of, well, actually, are the thresholds too high and inappropriate? Very often, yes. And how do we really localize them, knowing that in the kind of so-called humanitarian theatre of operation in which we work, which is the urban space, which isn't traditionally considered a humanitarian space, sort of several hours of moderate rain across informal settlements will cause floods, but it'll never meet the threshold for an official early warning. And actually at the hyper-local level, someone may be swept away, coming back to this security feeling you could be swept away in the middle of the night. Right? And that could be because there's a blocked water culvert, there's engineering, building works going on. So the knowledge needs to be really localized to kind of ward level. That's where the thresholds need to begin in the, as Sunaina calls the first, not the first mile, the first meter, right? Yeah. So I think the more kind of the more locally we can support communities to actually co-design and come up with their own triggers, the better, really.
Yeah. Great point. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you so much to the panelists. Great conversations. My name is Carol Werunga. I work with Urgent Action Fund Africa. It's a women's rights grant maker. So we support women rights organization across the 55 countries in Africa. So I was glad hearing about the references in some of the countries that we work in. And also I'm glad that we are speaking about issues of trust and also listening to the communities. And for me, really just to call upon us to reflect with regards to when we are saying listening to the communities, who are these communities? Because at the end of the day, we know, especially when it comes to crisis, more so climate crisis, is the women and the girls that are, highly impacted. But most of the time when we talk about the communities, we're already talking to the people who already have power, those who have access to decision-making spaces. And I'm sorry to say it, but the men. So, so even when we are giving this cash, who are we giving it to? Because at the end of the day, it is the women who know how to manage that household, how that community is managed, and how they respond to this crisis. And in Africa, actually, a lot of women grounded into the environment, they have close relationship with the environment, and they're able actually to predict some of these, crises. But most of the time, women are not given that space to actually think about, okay, I can predict this and this is how I can respond. I can help my community to respond to the crisis. So yes, I'm happy that we are interrogating the issues of power and also investing in trust and also listening to the community. But I'm encouraging us to go a little bit further and really unpack who has power in the community and who have actually the knowledge about responding to some of these crises. And more often, and research has actually shown it is the women. So thank you so much for that.
Brilliant comment. Thank you very much. Oh, we'll take one more question from this round and then we'll go to the panelists. Over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sarah Routley and I'm a MEL consultant currently working on with FCDO on one of their enablers programs. And my question is slightly linked to measuring. And I'm just interested to know how organizations face and address the challenge of measuring sort of the outcomes of some of this work, and particularly sort of not just the immediate outcomes of those directly involved in programs, but contribution to kind of the wider outcomes within this sector and linked to climate resilience, and how you found ways of evidencing this and sort of developing examples of change and your contribution to this. Thank you.
Great and quite difficult question. Thank you very much. So just to forewarn the panelists, Michael, I'm going to turn to you first on the issue of cash and social cohesion, and then also how Give Directly has been working with women and other marginalized groups to make sure that you're really reaching relevant people in the community. Kasivi, I'm then going to turn to you online, asking you about this question of who in the community is reached, how in particular your network has been working with women, and also to reflect on the outcomes question we just heard. How are we measuring outcomes? So Naina, I'll ask you to reflect on, maybe unfair, your colleagues, on Mark's question about localizing triggers, and also the gender question to you as well. And then Ahmed, I'll turn to you for that question on outcomes and measurements. So Michael, turning to you first, your thoughts on cash and social cohesion and how you're working with women.
Sure, and thanks for the great question. I actually think the follow-up question provided a lot of the background and context. So maybe I'm not the best person to answer, but I'll give Give Directly's reflections. I mean, the point you outline is absolutely true. I think the first thing I'd say, it's not unique to cash. It's in every aid program, and we often ask quite harder questions of cash than we do. My background before Give Directly was not in humanitarian cash; it was in much more traditional in-kind operations. But the problems you outlined doesn't mean we have a sort of free pass just because cash is great. So it's exactly the point of like who is the community you're dealing with, and Give Directly takes a very considered approach to who we work with in communities. And I think one issue that's very common in the humanitarian sector is like lack of clarity in targeting who gets what and why, and they're often extremely opaque. I couldn't explain to you a proxy means test, and I've certainly, with previous life as a donor, have used it. So how you're trying to explain that to a community, I don't know. Our default model, and when we do this wherever we can, is to what we call saturate an entire village. So in a place of extreme poverty or extreme climate vulnerability, provide assistance to every household. That still doesn't get you around the question of who you need to work with. And that's for any really good aid program, you need a system of safeguards and grievance redress mechanisms and community committees, and really strong staff on the ground with a strong relationship that don't just drop into a community, drop some cash and run away, but build on a established relationship. And then moving on to the question of women. I mean, we currently working in 12 countries. I think we're just about to give out our $1 billion since we started 15 years ago this year. So we've come across, it's extremely context specific, but we do see in a lot of cases that the women are the people who receive the money in the household. We don't mandate, and we have quite a lot of studies ongoing about the issues of intimate partner violence and looking at how we do no harm with our cash transfers and looking at the safeguarding risks. And we don't always get that right, but it's something we're acutely aware of, and would love to hear people's own reflections from their own experience of working in places around the world. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Kasivi, we're going to turn to you online. Within your network, how do you think about measuring success? How do you think about measuring the outcomes of some of this work? And how do you include marginalized populations and ensure that you're including women? Over to you. And we can see
thank
you.
You so much. Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, and thanks for the questions and the different comments that we've had. Coming to the who has the power in the community, first of all, I think it's a very, very broad question, and we have no definitive answer. But it's clear that we need to work to improve the equity in the society. We've seen in some communities, for example, if you go to Mauritania, you say who has the power, most of people will tell you women have the power. So the issue of the power is not, there is no standard answer, I would say, but I completely agree, and in gender we stand for that, to work for gender equity, because at the end of the day, those who face the immediate impact of hazard are women. They are the one who deal with the whole family. They are the one who deal with the children, and sometimes men provide only, if possible, the means. But when it's come to providing resources like given directly to communities, I'm not very well positioned to respond, as we never send cash. However, I completely agree with my colleague from Uganda that we need to improve and enhance the capacity of the women to lead better the resilience phase in the communities. Concerning the measurement of the outcome, we know the traditional means, that consist of ticking the box of the objective we've achieved. But in gender, we focus more on sustainability. So the first question we ask ourselves in our team is, what have we left to the communities? And how are the communities capable to to ensure their own stability, their own development themselves? So, and as one of the intervenants said earlier, Sunayana, I think, we do not implement for communities. We engage communities in implementation. But to build this capacity and to make sure that we are living something sustainable and we are enhancing the capacity of the communities themselves to take the leadership, because that should be the end, especially when we talk about localization. That should be the end of activities. It's extremely important to provide the resources. We know the communities have the knowledge. We can help them phrase it. We can help them frame it. We can support their organization, but we never do things for communities. We help communities to do their own things the way they want it. That's why we work on the prioritization of the activities. And once we finish that exercise with them, the resources are provided to the community. So again, to measure, I think, the impact of our activities in development/humanitarian, it's important to include a dimension of sustainability, where we ask ourselves, what have we left? How have we contributed to building a sustainable community, rather than sorting out or solving a very specific problem for a very short time? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So Sunaina, we're going to turn to you for any expansion on Mark's thoughts about super localized triggers, and maybe a response to the thought in the room that engaging women can help us to know when disasters are coming and what to do about them. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks to Mark, my colleague, for bringing up the point about localization. Now, Mark used the localization of triggers, or rather thresholds, as an example, but it's really the localization of everything, including early warnings and information, and the channels through which the information is disseminated. But because Mark brought up triggers and thresholds, just to expand on what we do and how it's benefiting, we are currently working on developing community level early action plans. So these are sort of more downstream from the city level early action plans that are led by the city authorities. Now, with these community early action plans, the premise is that the communities that we work with are informal settlement communities, and the physical environment of the communities are have greater risks than maybe what more affluent parts of the city might have, and that means that there has to be very specific. There have to be plans, thresholds, triggers that are very specific to that context. So we have been working with the communities and the National Meteorological Services to kind of look at what the thresholds are at a city level and then downscale it to the community. So that means looking at some of the historic data about the weather event, but also looking at impact data specifically for these areas, looking at what are the different factors that increase the risk, in like the physical risk in the space, and incorporating that into the thresholds as well. So so this is ongoing work, and we still have to look at the outcomes of that and measure. And it's only after, I think, a few months we'll be in a position to make any strong case about localization of thresholds. Right now, it's a hypothesis, and all of us believe in that premise. But yes, it's generally about downscaling all of the information and making context-specific plans and frameworks. On the second point, so the question about when we engage with communities, who are we really engaging with within these communities, and whether they are the, whether they are the most marginalized groups, or whether we're actually targeting the right people. That's an important question, and that's been a question we have been asking ourselves from the start of the Raja, and how do we do it best? I'll be honest, we haven't quite cracked the problem yet, but we have been trying to do our best. So in the places we work, we have a few different processes and a few different pilots and interventions that we run. Some of them are specifically working with women or specifically designed around women, whereas some of the other interventions and processes do involve working with the existing community hierarchies and structures. This is where I'll again reiterate the point I made, which is working with local NGOs and CSOs are really helpful, because they understand the community dynamics, the social dynamics, the power dynamics there, and they're in a really good position to help us navigate these things. In Uganda, in Kampala specifically, because I know the questions have come from our colleagues in Kampala, we are working with women's savings groups alongside, the other members of the community, but we are specifically working with women's savings group for this exact reason, that they are in a much better position to make decisions for the whole household. There's also a difference in sort of like channels that women use versus men. Now we work in the space of early warnings, so distribution or dissemination of information and early warnings is critical. So we look at the media consumption habits of community members, and we find that there's a difference between how women access information versus how men access information, and we try and incorporate those findings into our design process. It's not always easy because we're working with a lot of limitations, or we're working within a structure. But we do the best we can, but there's still a long way to go. Yeah, back to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much. Fantastic answers from all of the panelists. There's so much in there. Ahmed, if you'll forgive me, I'll save your reflections for the next round of questions, just with an eye on the time. I'll open back up to questions from the room. And I also in particular want to pick on the back row that I'm looking at here, which contains at least 3 people who probably know more than anyone else at HNPW about how we can keep climate smart programming on the table. So any reflections from you guys particularly welcome. Any other questions or comments? Damien? Yeah.
Yeah, so in response to your question, I think how to keep this a relevant topic in terms of climate smart humanitarian action. I mean, I think that it's going to be extremely challenging, I think is the message. I mean, if you look at what's happening in terms of humanitarian funding, we could quite easily end up at the end of the year at half the amount of humanitarian funding that there was even a couple of years ago. So the whole humanitarian system could easily halve. And there's naturally going to be a reflection and move towards life-saving activity. And sadly to say, climate smart humanitarian action will be seen in terms of resilience building, transformational work, which will become deprioritized. I think that is a brutal reality to face. Now, one response to it is clearly to counter that argument and say, no, there is a life-saving element to this. And I think, yeah, you need to continue to do that. Other elements is certainly around accessing more climate financing, and it's great to hear the lost and damage fund that you're going to be accessing. I think another way to look at this is through the whole nexus and trying to see this in terms of actually breaking down the barriers between humanitarian development and climate actors. Now, the extent to which you see this as an opportunity, but clearly developmental actors are also very much working on climate related activities. And so in that sense, there's a humanitarian development peace nexus for people, follow that. For me, there's absolutely no reason why climate shouldn't be the fourth leg of this, so the extent to which you should argue that. And then the approaches that there's been to break down these barriers, ultimately, in my view, has failed over the last few years in terms of there hasn't been this transformational way of working between humanitarian development actors. And that's precisely what needs to happen in terms of climate action. Now, to take an example, a very concrete one in Chad, where I worked, very climate affected country. In the east of the country, WFP is handing out cash assistance, I think at $10 at the maximum month, which is clearly insufficient to do anything for any family benefiting from that. And at the same time, you have the World Bank, who is giving cash assistance through a government agency to the same people. Now, there's an argument to say that it's completely irrelevant to have two separate forms of humanitarian development programming. And as we heard from the Give Directory example, if this was to be not separate program, not humanitarian development, just to say it's crisis response and to program completely jointly, then you would put the money together and you would have lump sums and you would increase the opportunities for those recipients to make the choices that they can not only live on subsistence, but they can invest to become more climate resilient. So it's a much more radical form of just collapsing humanitarian development program. The other one, and it's now being discussed, is taking much more, looking at organizations that, WFP, the largest food agency, has invested a lot in climate work in the last few years. Its budget was 14 billion a few years ago, is likely to halve by the end of this year. It does life saving, it does resilience, and climate action is in the resilience camp. And there's a strong argument, I would say, to stop it completely at the moment, because it has to focus on its life saving. Now, that would be terrible for climate smart humanitarian action. The other way to look at it is you have a development organization, FAO, who works on more developmental and also environment. Why not merge the two organizations, and then you have an organization that would not have the excuse to sideline climate, humanitarian development. It really doesn't matter at that point. So those are two suggestions. But I think in terms of positioning the sound of the argument, and that's maybe the question, how beneficial would you see it to just saying this needs a massively transformational approach to this nexus, making climate center stage of that, and then mapping out, I've given two examples, I'm sure there's other ways, and saying this is how it would look like and this is what you need to do.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Any other reflections or questions from the room? Brilliant. Okay, Kirsten and then Paul. Kirsten, over to you.
Okay. Just one other quick question, and building on what Damien was said, I think there is an argument during this conversation around humanitarian transformation that the way that you save lives is to manage risks. And those risks are conflict, they're climate, they're disasters, and they're not only the risks of what's already happened and the impacts that are flowing from it today and tomorrow, they're also the risks of what's going to happen in a week, in a month, and in a year. And I think there is a really important framing that investment does actually save lives if you're investing in all of the relevant risks. So I think there's a piece around that. The question that I would ask to the group, as I presume you're going to do a kind of a quick round of feedback, is if we were to be pulling together, and I know Sophie's done a great job of this with the AAP Community of Practice, a list of recommendations in the light of this humanitarian transformation. And these need to be recommendations in terms of how do we actually maintain the accountability to people, to community needs and to community risks. And how do we make sure that this new system or whatever it is fit for purpose? What would be your one recommendation in light of this conversation today? Because I think there's a lot of people in the room that are having these conversations, and we can all help each other to have a really good list of this is the what and this is the why. Thanks.
Great suggestion, which I'll steal for the wrap up. Thank you very much. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. Can I just say how much I enjoyed the panel so far? Really, really, really interesting speakers, really great speakers. Thank you for organizing it. Just a thought and a question. The thought in direct response to what do we do about less money is, I think, it interests me to see how much of the humanitarian climate work has taken place in the food security livelihood sector, and how, which is, obviously of central importance to people's lives. It's also, however, a very difficult place to make a difference with relation to climate change without very large kind of systemic changes to markets, infrastructure, social structures, as you pointed out. I think much less attention has gone to the health sector to water and sanitation, and to some of these more structural and systemic areas where you can really move the dial in quite a lot of areas with very, very limited investments in community health work, primary health care, and so on. So I think one thing, as people who are interested in climate in fragile and conflict affected spaces, is broadening the approach to look at a wider range of sectors and how they can address the climate crisis and make people more resilient, or help people to become more resilient to the climate crisis. And I think that's something that, you know, is easily done, but the sectors and the mandates and the turf thing probably gets in the way. The question I have is, I'd like to ask, if possible, if any of the panelists could expand further on your fourth point that you made, which is this idea that when you talk to people, they said that we were anticipating to and responding to the wrong things. Now, I know we've talked about that a little bit, but we're not interested in climate because we're interested in climate, I think. But we're interested in climate because, like conflict and like other shocks, it makes people's lives very hard to do. But if we're not interested in the right things, the things that really are shocking people and making it hard for people to survive, then I think there's a really important point there, and I'd be interested to hear more about it.
Great, thank you so much. So I'll hand back to the panelists in a second, but just to explain where that finding came from. So that what really nudged us in that direction was some findings from Nigeria, where people were telling us that they had experienced major flooding the previous year and had received some anticipatory action support for those major floods. Those major floods had knocked out all of their assets, and since that flood there had been major inflation of, I think, 30%, or really severe inflation. There was an economic crisis. And what people were telling us was the floods that are predicted this year are going to be smaller, so they're not going to trigger any kind of anticipatory response, but they're going to hit us much harder, not because there'll be more water, but because we have less means to get through these floods. And I think we've heard similar findings from a bunch of contexts. I think, Damien, you and I have also had a chat about some similar challenges that you experienced in Chad. So that's where that finding came from. But maybe, Ahmed, if I could turn to you for any reflections on either Paul's question, how do we know that we're anticipating and responding to the right things, or anything else that you've heard. Ahmed, I'll hand the floor to you.
Thank you. I just want to highlight one key aspect. When we talk about climate change, and especially in the Maldivian context as well, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So there are compounding factors, and we're living through several risks within the community and several marginalized groups as well. As a national society, I believe, and as a very young national society, just 15 years old, we've actually been quite fortunate being part of the International Federation. So we have inherited many of the good practices within the movement when it comes to humanitarian service delivery in the climate action portfolio. I believe the auxiliary role with the government stakeholders, it has been instrumental in delivering our work. So as a community-based organization within the country, it's always it's been instrumental to have a seat at the table when it comes to discussions with the government and reflecting on the standardization of the training systems and the minimum aid support that was rolled out by the government as well. So having a voice and having a seat at the table with the government has been crucial in that sense, even at a point where we've been the voice for the Disaster Management Agency as well. So there's been instances where the National Disaster Management Authority comes to us and lets us know things that they can't say at the table, which we could. So there's been a bit of a tag team approach with the authorities as well. And that in itself, I believe, reflects the trust with the national society in the country, which is the case with several national societies in the movement as well. Reflecting on the outcomes and measurements on how do we measure the implementation and all of this, whether we are catering to the same the people that we need to. Reporting, like monitoring and evaluation, has been a challenge, especially for a national society implementing programs with several donors. One thing that we've tried to not always successful, but what we've tried to implement is having a standard report by the National Society, which could cater for all the donors. While I say this, I understand many of you would understand that wouldn't cater for many donors, but pushing that has been instrumental, has been useful in a sense. It minimizes the administrative and the burden on the National Society, while we address on the services to the community to minimize the burden of reporting to individual and several donors at a point. I would like to reflect on one of the quotes from Jagan, the IFRS Secretary General, during COP. With the loss and damage fund as well as any climate fund, we need to minimize the process, the value chain between the fund and the community. So any fund that is being put up and operationalized needs no more than 1 or 2 middlemen to operationalize the funds and to tap into it. So we need to make the funds as accessible as possible. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm going to come straight back to you while you have the mic. So thank you so much to our panelists today. This has been, I agree, Paul, this has been a really great conversation, and it's been really good to hear your views from across the world and in the room. To take Kirsten's challenge and make it a bit more basic, I would like each of you to imagine that you've been parachuted into one of these humanitarian leadership meetings that are happening at the moment, where people are taking these impossible decisions about what humanitarian aid stays, what can be cut, and what the future of humanitarian aid looks like. If you were parachuted in for 30 seconds, what would be your key recommendation, your key plea to them? What do you want them not to forget as they're making these decisions? So Ahmed, we'll stay with you. What's your key message to them?
Yes, I would reflect on my experience in the past 2 COPs when it comes to the SIDS countries and their call for action. That climate change is happening right now. We are going through it. We are experiencing it right now, and I reflect on the key messages from the Federation as well, that climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. It is a health crisis. And invest in communities. We have the solutions. It's a matter of scaling up and delivering to the communities, and we need to act now and ahead of the crisis. Thank you.
Brilliant, very, very clear. Thank you. So Nene, since I can see you on the screen, I'm handing the mic to you. You're dropped into the principals meeting. What's your key message to them?
Well, don't go in with fully designed interventions. Just take a moment to listen to the communities first, and then work with them to co-design and co-deliver the right interventions, and work with local organizations.
Brilliant, very clear, and fully agree. Lots of nodding in this room while you were speaking. Kosivi, over to you. You're in the IASC principals meeting. What are you telling them?
I would just say it's important to recognize climate change as a risk amplifier and work with the local communities.
Fantastic, thank you, very clear. Michael, you have the last word. Over to you.
Oh, I mean, first of all, I think those people are being faced with some impossible choices, and it's, you know, it's easy to say, so do this and do that from here, but there's some really horrible trade-offs that they should never be asked to make at the speed they're being made. But I guess my message would be, I mean, these are very complicated times. I'm a pretty simple person. I would urge them to be brave enough to take the the practical solutions that are in front of them, and look at the facts and look at the figures, and appreciate the politics of aid are complicated at the moment, but there are some solutions open to us around cash, around being more community centered. And if now's not the time to take them, then it maybe never is. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you so much. For my part, from Ground Truth Solutions, the message that you're all probably sick of hearing, because we've been shouting it from every panel this week, is if this prioritization exercise is not being driven by what communities want, need and prefer, by the voices of people on the front lines of crisis, then we're going to waste a lot of things. We're going to waste lives, we're going to waste livelihoods, we're going to waste opportunities, and less importantly, but perhaps more compellingly in some of these conversations, we're going to waste a lot of money. So thank you so much to everyone in the room, to all of the panelists for joining this discussion today. It's been really interesting. I've learned a lot. Pam has very kindly recorded it, so this will be preserved. And if you want to go back and see your best moments, this will be posted online. But a huge thanks to all of you. I hope that you can take some of the messages and recommendations that you've heard today and use them in whichever conversations you're part of. As we keep being challenged in these rooms, we need to take some of these key messages out of the rooms in which everyone agrees with them and take them out into the world where, unfortunately, they're under a lot of threat. So that's it from us. We're in Switzerland. We're on Swiss time. We've run a mere 1 minute over. Thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye.